Most Sopranos fans know Frank Vincent as Phil Leotardo, the permanently angry New York mobster who spent most of his time talking about respect, betrayal, family honor, and of course, the 20 years he spent in prison. But what a lot of people probably don't know is that, while Frank Vincent was playing one of the most ruthless characters on television, he was also writing an actual book teaching men how to live. And somehow, that book is exactly what you would imagine a book written by Phil Leotardo might look like. It was called A Guy's Guide to Being a Man's Man, and Frank Vincent released it with writer Stephen Pregay in 2006, right in the middle of his run on The Sopranos. This wasn't some autobiography about filming Goodfellas or Casino. It was basically Frank Vincent's personal handbook for how a man should dress, date, eat, cook, travel, groom himself, carry himself in public, and generally move through life with a little bit of class. And the deeper you look into this book, the more incredible it gets. Because the foreword was written by none other than James Gandolfini. So you basically had Phil Leotardo writing a guide to being a man, with Tony Soprano introducing it. That alone makes this one of the strangest and most overlooked pieces of Sopranos history. But what makes the book even more interesting is that Frank Vincent apparently took the idea pretty seriously. The whole concept of being a man's man sounds like it's going to be some ridiculous collection of macho advice about fighting people and acting tough. But Vincent's actual definition was surprisingly different. In an interview promoting the book, he said the most important quality a man could have was respect. Respect for other people, but also respect for yourself. He talked about honor, loyalty, humor, manners, personal appearance, and taking pride in the way you present yourself. And honestly, when you think about Frank Vincent, that makes perfect sense. This was a guy who spent decades playing some of the most intimidating men in movies, but there was always something extremely polished about him. Billy Batts in Goodfellas, Frank Marino in Casino, Phil Leotardo in The Sopranos. These guys weren't walking around looking sloppy. The suits were tailored. The hair was perfect. The shoes were polished. Everything about the way they carried themselves communicated something before they even opened their mouths. And Vincent apparently believed some version of that in real life too. One of the things he complained about while promoting the book was seeing men walking around New York looking like they had completely given up on their appearance. His argument was basically that taking care of yourself wasn't vanity. It was self-respect. He talked about ironing your clothes, grooming yourself properly, wearing things that actually fit, and looking like you put some thought into leaving the house. Which is hilarious when you remember that this advice is coming from the same man who played Phil Leotardo. Imagine Phil sitting Christopher down and explaining the importance of a proper manicure. But that is genuinely the kind of territory this book goes into. There are sections about dating, how to handle a first date, how to dress, how to cook, restaurant, music, movies, Vegas, getting into exclusive nightclubs, grooming, accessories. The book basically tries to create an entire lifestyle. There are even recipes in it. This man went from telling Joe Pesci to go get his shine box to giving people cooking and fashion advice. And it gets better. The book also included conversations with people from Frank Vincent's world, including Steven Van Zandt, Vincent Pastore, and James Caan. So it almost feels like this bizarre alternate universe Sopranos round table where a bunch of iconic tough guy actors are discussing what they think a gentleman is supposed to be. But there's one detail about all of this that I think is genuinely fascinating. During an interview, somebody actually asked Frank Vincent whether Phil Leotardo himself qualified as a man's man. And Vincent basically said no. He acknowledged that Phil had qualities he respected, like loyalty and strength, but then pointed out the obvious problem. Phil murders people. So according to Frank Vincent's own rulebook, Phil Leotardo didn't even qualify. There is something unbelievably funny about the actor who played Phil essentially disqualifying his own character from being a respectable man. But it also says something interesting about how different Frank Vincent was from the characters people associated him with. For decades, audiences saw his face and immediately thought gangster. He had one of those faces where he could walk into a movie, say 3 words, and you already assumed somebody was about to have a serious problem. Martin Scorsese used that presence perfectly. In Goodfellas, one conversation with Tommy DeVito turns into one of the most memorable confrontations in the entire movie. In Casino, he's once again part of this brutal criminal world. And then The Sopranos comes along and turns him into Phil Leotardo, probably the ultimate Frank Vincent character. Proud, stubborn, perfectly dressed, obsessed with respect, completely incapable of letting anything go. You could almost look at Phil as a completely corrupted version of the values Vincent talks about in his book. Phil constantly talks about honor and loyalty, but everything eventually becomes an excuse for anger, revenge, and violence. Frank Vincent's version of those ideas was apparently much simpler. Respect yourself. Respect other people. Take care of how you present yourself. Have manners. Have confidence. Know how to conduct yourself. And maybe that is why this book is such an interesting piece of Sopranos history. Because it gives you a weird glimpse at the man behind one of the show's most intimidating characters. Frank Vincent spent his career perfecting the image of the old-school tough guy. But when he finally sat down and wrote a book explaining what he thought a man should actually be, the message wasn't really about being feared. It was about having standards. Obviously, parts of the book are intentionally over the top. It came out in 2006, and some of the advice definitely belongs to that particular era. There's plenty of humor in it, and the entire concept is clearly having some fun with Frank Vincent's image. But underneath the jokes, you can tell there was something about that old-school idea of presentation that Vincent genuinely believed in. And maybe the craziest part is how perfectly the book captures a very specific generation of Italian-American entertainment culture. Sinatra. Tailored suits. Good restaurants, cooking, Vegas. Classic movies. Taking pride in your appearance. Treating dinner like an event instead of something you eat standing over the kitchen sink. It's basically an entire worldview preserved inside one extremely Frank Vincent book. And somehow James Gandolfini is there at the beginning of it all, writing the foreword. For Sopranos fans, that alone makes it worth knowing exists. Because somewhere out there is an actual book where Phil Leotardo teaches you how to dress, cook, date, groom yourself, choose a restaurant, and become a better man. With Tony Soprano introducing the whole thing. Honestly, they really don't make people like Frank Vincent anymore.